So today we're going to look at the first book of the Bible in Genesis and focus on that first chapter, which talks about God as being the central role in the creation of all that exists. And I think, this past week, everybody's attention has been on nature and everything, right? From the solar eclipse all the way down to Texas with Hurricane Harvey hitting land last night. By the way, in regard to that, if you'd like to help out with disaster relief, if you can write a check to the church and put in the memo, hurricane disaster relief, and we've got connections through LCMC down there, and we can make sure that those resources are given to those that are in need. So as we look at Genesis and we talk about the beginning of everything, I want to make very clear that we're not talking about the beginning of God. We're talking about the beginning of the universe and the world and all that. And there's a very good reason for that, because we believe that God is eternal. And by saying that God is eternal, we are literally saying that God has no end, and this is the part that makes my brain hurt, and no beginning. Therefore, by definition, God is supernatural, spiritual, right? And supernatural, the definition is it's an adjective, and it literally means something with the force and the power that is beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature. We're going to come back to this. God is outside the realm of science, okay? Now, when it comes to a discussion of creation, if you watch, it seems like science and faith in a creator just come crashing into each other and are going like this all the time, right? And the presentation is that science and Christianity are absolutely incompatible with each other. And as a result, people get, all emotional. They end up ridiculing each other and making statements that are flung all over the place and are made as if they are fact. I have a passion about this. And the reason I have a passion about this is because our youth and our young adults are often the collateral damage in those presentations and those arguments. And a lot of times they find their faith in a creator as being hit broadside, and they're unable to withstand the blow. And what it usually boils down to, if you just look at the surface, what it usually boils down to are those that call themselves evolutionists and creationists. But I would contend that that's all window dressing, and that there is something far deeper at work than science and Christianity. And I'm going to come back to that toward the end of my sermon. So I want to walk through just kind of what I'm talking about, because we have parents and youth that are caught in this sticky web. As a matter of fact, I had a parent just this last month send me an email and say, my son is learning this, his faith is getting rocked. Have you heard of this author or this author? And I heard of all of them, and I knew their perspective and where they were coming from, and was able to kind of coach and encourage this parent on how to deal with this situation. So here's some of these guys that I want to point out. One of them is William Provine. He's from Cornell University, and he made this statement that if Darwinian evolutionary theory is true, then there are 5 inescapable conclusions, okay? This is what he says. If Darwinian theory is true, there's no evidence for God, there's no life after death, there's no absolute foundation of right and wrong, there's no ultimate meaning of life, and people don't really have free will. Now, how you can go from a scientific theory into a proclamation of moral and theological final analysis just escapes me, but I'm just a pea-brained pastor, right? Harvard geneticist Richard Lowenstein writes this. He says here's his problem. The problem is to get people to reject irrational and supernatural explanations of the world, the demons that exist only in their minds, and to accept a social and intellectual apparatus, science, as the only begetter of truth. Philip E. Johnson writes in an article, a 1999 article in the Wall Street Journal, he writes this: science has become identified with a philosophy. This guy I agree with. He says science has become identified with a philosophy known as materialism or scientific naturalism. This philosophy insists that nature is all there is, or at least the only thing about which we can have any knowledge. And it follows that nature has to do its own creating. Nature has to do its own creating. I'm going to come back to that too. And that the means of creation must not have included in any way a role of God. Okay, let's take a look at evolution. By the way, I'm just trying to have a frank conversation about this, right? So when it comes to evolution, you may or may not agree with me, but I think I'm right, so I got the pulpit, so I'll say this. When it comes to evolution, to me it seems obvious that there is such a phenomenon as microevolution, variation within different kinds of animals. And, all I got to do is walk into my backyard and look at my two Shih Tzus. I mean, they're both the same breed of dog, but they are vastly different than each other. Their coloring is different. Their temperament is different. They are just as different as night and day. And if that doesn't convince me, all I got to do is look through the slats in my fence and see my neighbor's dog, Gracie, a Rottweiler named Gracie. You catch the ironic? Gracie's actually named really well, but you look at Gracie and you look at my dogs, there's a huge difference going on, right? So I'm going, this kind of makes sense. But when you move into the more ambitious claim of what's called macroevolution, where natural selection tries to explain how everything came into being, including life itself, from primitive cells morphed over long periods of time into every species of creatures, including us, that becomes a very different conversation. I mean, some of the tenets are the same, but you're really making a quantum leap in the conversation. Now, I've been throwing names out, and you're probably going, no, I don't recognize any of these names. They're probably just crazy people. But this is a name that I know you'll recognize. Oxford evolutionist Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins came to Omaha a few years ago and gave a presentation down at the Halling Center, and I know there's a few hundred people that went to it. And he says this. He says, the more you understand the significance of evolution, the more you are pushed away from an agnostic position and toward atheism. I have two words for Richard Dawkins. Oh, really? Right? There's something other than science going on here, guys. So Lee Strobel, I've talked about Lee Strobel in the past, wrote The Case for Christ, wrote a book, The Case for Faith. He also wrote a book called The Case for a Creator. And Lee Strobel was an atheist, and a lot of what drove him to an atheist viewpoint was the way that evolutionary theory was presented to him in school, okay? And again, when we talk evolutionary theory, I believe there's something behind it that is driving one's faith in God or not. And we're going to talk about that. He says that as it moved him in his understanding and his view of God and creation, there were these dangling questions in the back of his mind that nothing just quite resonated, didn't quite make sense to him. And here's some of his questions. He said, are science and faith doomed to always be at war? Is there a fundamentally different way to view the relationship between the spiritual and the scientific? Does the latest scientific evidence tend to point toward or away from the existence of God? And are the images of evolution that spurred me to atheism still valid in light of the most recent discoveries in science? In his book, he cites an interesting event which happened after the broadcasting of a PBS special on evolution back in 2001. It was part of the Nova series. He writes this. He says, after the spokespersons for the public broadcasting system's 7-part television series Evolution asserted that all known scientific evidence supports Darwinian evolution, as does virtually every reputable scientist in the world, a group of scientists, professors, laboratory researchers, Other scientists published a 2-page advertisement in a national magazine under the banner, "A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism." He said their statement was direct and defiant. "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged." Now, he notes that these were not narrow-minded fundamentalists. They weren't backwoods West Virginia protesters or rabid religious zealots and fanatics. You know, it's just respected world-class scientists like Nobel nominee Henry F. Schaefer, who's one of the most cited chemists in the world, James Tour of Rice University's Center of Nanoscale Science and Technology, and Fred Figworth, professor of cellular and molecular physiology at Yale Graduate School. You know, just those guys. Together, I find this fascinating. He wrote, "Together, despite the specter of professional persecution," why would someone be persecuted professionally for holding up a scientific viewpoint? But there's persecution. They broached the politically incorrect opinion that the emperor of evolution has no clothes. Why would they be attacked? There is something else going on. He goes on. He says, "As a high school student and a university student studying evolution, I was never told that there were credible scientists who harbored significant skepticism toward Darwinian theory. I'd been under the impression that it was only know-nothing pastors, who objected to the evolution on the grounds that it contradicted the Bible claims." Again, I'm not against microevolution. I just call into question macroevolution. I think there's a whole lot more study that needs to be done. Strobel says, "I wasn't aware of the fact that according to historian Peter Bowler, substantive scientific critiques of natural selection started in the early 1900s, and its opponents were convinced it would never recover." So coming out of that, there are all kinds of ideas, speculations about how life came into existence. There's a guy by the name of Walter Bradley. He is a former professor at Texas A&M University, and he co-authored a book, a landmark book in 1984 called The Mystery of Life's Origin. And what he took was a bunch of these ideas, and he put them to scientific tests. These ideas were like random chance, things just kind of happened to come into being. The view of chemical affinity, that the chemical reactions that kind of came and interacted with each other sparked life. That there were self-ordering tendencies, that it was just kind of this inert propulsion toward life coming into being. I like this one, seeding from space. I'm going to come back to this one with Richard Dawkins in a little bit. Deep sea ocean vents. This is like volcanoes under the ocean. They produce magma and heat, and they say that somehow life happened because of that. And it's interesting. There is kind of interesting creatures that hang around these spots in the ocean. And then the last one, to use clay to encourage prebiotic chemicals to assemble. So what he did was he ran all kinds of scientific tests on each one of these ideas. And you know what? This is his results on all of them. He demonstrated that not one of them can withstand any scientific scrutiny. And yet people say, well, here's my idea. And everybody goes, oh, great idea, right? Bradley is convinced that the absolutely overwhelming evidence points toward an intelligence behind life's creation. In fact, he says this statement, "I think people who believe that life emerged naturalistically need to have a great deal more faith than people who reasonably infer that there's an intelligent design." Even those who are not religious in nature, looking at all the scientific evidence, use a very strange word for scientists. And the word is miracle. A couple of them. John Horgan, he identifies himself as a lapsed Catholic. In other words, he was raised Catholic, and he kind of fell off the Catholic bandwagon and is now rolling around in the ditch somewhere trying to figure out what he is, right? And he concedes back in 2002 that scientists literally have no idea how the universe was created, how inanimate matter on our little planet coalesced into living creatures. And he says this sentence: science, you might say, has discovered that our existence is infinitely improbable and hence a miracle. Now again, here's all these names, I know, but here's a name you'll know. Biochemist, spiritual skeptic, Francis Crick. Heard of him? He shared the Nobel Peace Prize with another dude, right? In discovering DNA, unlocking DNA, presenting DNA to the world, right? And he cautiously invokes the word miracle. Listen to his statement. It just kind of cracks me up. He's just like, he takes a step and doesn't like the step he's taken, right? He says, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, there's his first hedge, in some sense, the origin of life appears, there's another hedge, at the moment, to almost, there's another hedge, to be a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. He says, we don't know how. So Lee Strobel had a bunch of questions, and I got a bunch of questions. And my questions have not been answered to my satisfaction adequately by especially those that attack Christianity with science. And here's my questions. Why do the macroevolutionary scientists get all emotional when their theories are challenged? And the concept of intelligent design is mentioned. I mean, they explode like a volcano. I mean, why is there that kind of emotional reaction to scientific inquiry? I mean, my view of a scientist is you got a theory, you test it objectively, and you go, oh, that didn't work out, and maybe, well, this, you know, and you just kind of move along. But these guys go crazy. I would contend there is something else going on more than scientific theory. Here's the one I don't get. How can something that does not exist create itself into existence in a naturalistic kind of way? I mean, their premise is that nature created itself out of nothing. I'm just this pea-bearing pastor that they're talking about. I don't get that, right? How can the complexities and the intricacies of life come from randomness? I mean, you look at the vastness of the universe, and you look at the complexities of our bodies, and we're told, oh, it just randomly happened, right? The greatest tome of wisdom I ever got to take that on, I call it Pastor Schaff's Lincoln Log Theory. Huh, Tom, you remember this one, right? So here's my question. I got this great little picture. There's 3 different buildings here. I really like this 2-story one, right? Nice blue roof. Got the red risers on both sides. Bunch of windows, door, and got a little tree and a cowboy and a fence, right? So here's my question. I shake it up. I open the box, and I'll throw this into the air. This was my children's sermon earlier. I'm not going to do it because it takes so long to pick it up. Throw this into the air. How many times would I have to do that in order to get this building with the cowboy, the tree, and the nice little... Anybody want to guess? How many times? I'm receiving no answers. 3 times? You think 3 times I could do it? Probably not. Okay, just say what you're thinking. It's not going to happen, right? That's impossible. It will not. And I could demonstrate to you, and it doesn't even come close. I mean, you got a bunch of pieces on the floor. And we go, it couldn't happen. You couldn't shake this up. You couldn't throw it in the air, and it would never happen. And yet, we're told the vastness of the universe, the complexities of a body, happen by random chance, and we go, oh, okay. Hello? I mean, who's checking whose brain at the door, guys? This doesn't make any sense. Pastor Schaff is brilliant. Here's my next question. How can DNA be called by everybody the blueprint of life, and yet the thought of an architect of life is unreasonable? Last time I checked, to get a blueprint, you need an architect that draws a blueprint so that you have something to work off of, right? So how come one is okay and the other is not? There's something else at work. Why is it that when it comes to macroevolutionary theory, the one cog, the central cog that's called the missing link, how come the only thing that we know about the missing link definitively without question is it's missing? And lastly, if science is based on cause and effect, what was the cause that brought the effect of everything into existence? Would that cause not have to be supernatural, outside of nature, beyond the scope of scientific inquiry? Here's Richard Dawkins again. I watched a video, I heard him say this, I saw him say this. He was pressed and pressed and pressed upon how life came to earth, and he finally basically threw his hands up and said, well, my theory is that it was brought from extraterrestrial aliens and seeded on earth. And I know you're all kind of chuckling inside, right? But let's say, okay, Richard, I'll run with that. I'll buy into that. Sure, why not? Let's examine that. Then the next question is, where'd the aliens come from? You see, he didn't answer the question. He just deflected the question and moved the bucket to another location, right? And so you just begin the inquiry all over again. Now, I want you to hear this. I love science. I find it fascinating. Science improves the quality of our life in so many ways. I mean, the medical field alone improves our life so much. It delves into mysteries. It asks questions that are so exciting, and it has tools to research things, right? But I am hard-pressed, folks. I am hard-pressed to see how science that asks the question of how in light and cause and effect, right, is in conflict with Christianity, which answers the question of how and why in the supernatural. They're not at odds. They fit hand in glove. The supernatural is outside the scope of scientific inquiry by definition. So what is at work is not pure science at odds with Christianity. What is at odds with Christianity is a philosophy called naturalism hiding under the veil of science. It's a philosophy. I would call it a theology or an atheology that is walking kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is not science itself, but rather a belief system in which the belief is that only natural laws, not supernatural, not spiritual laws, only natural laws are the forces that are operational in the world. I believe a scientist can be either an atheist or a Christian. You know why I can say that? Because they're sitting amongst us right now. Christian scientists who do not find that their science in any way, shape, or form is in conflict with their faith. It is something else. It is an atheology under the guise of science that says nature is all there is. This next part is pretty cool. Even some atheists are bold enough to call into question the philosophy of naturalism hiding behind science. One guy that does it, his name is Thomas Nagel. He wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. While the materialistic neo-Darwinian concept of nature is almost certainly false. He wrote it in 2012. And you're probably thinking, yeah, he's some crackpot, he found some weird publisher that would publish his book. Yeah, he found a weird press that would publish it. You've probably never heard of these guys called Oxford University Press. It's 144 pages long. It's for sale for $24.95 on Amazon if you want to pick it up and read it this afternoon. Science does not determine one's faith or lack thereof. It's these other factors. So the philosophy or the atheology of naturalism wants us to believe that the world created itself out of nothing. And when I peeled that back this week thinking about this, I thought, why would the world want to make that claim? I mean, it's a crazy claim, but they want to make that claim, right? I think it's because the world wants to be in control and have all the power. I think the world wants to be the center of attention and be worshiped. I think the world wants to push God right out of the picture, and I think the world wants to be all there is. And then it hit me. I don't know why I didn't see this before, but what's the root of all sin? It's pride, self-centeredness, arrogance, right? And what does sin want to do? It wants to be in control and have all the power. Where we are the center of attention and where we want to be worshiped. Where we want to push God out of the picture, where we want to be all there is. Does that sound familiar? We're going to talk more about sin next week, so you got to come back. So in Genesis 1, we hear this vast variety of things that God created, but the focus isn't so much on the things that are created as it is on the Creator, right? In the passage it hears that God said and came into being and it was so, right? And God spoke the universe, the planet, humankind into existence, and God said what? It is good. The Hebrew word it's tov. Tov. And there's all kinds of definitions of tov, but in this particular case, I think what tov means is it's the way it's supposed to be. It's complete. It's perfect. God is saying, what I have created is tov. It's good. It's the way I want it. And then sin comes crashing in, right? Have you ever pondered why on the seventh day God rested? You ever thought about that? Was God just exhausted from creating everything? On the seventh day God goes, whew, glad that's over. No, I don't think that affected God. I think on the seventh day God rested. You know why? Because it was tov. He's done. Nothing more to add. It's good. It's kind of the way I want it, right? And then sin comes crashing in, right? And it's not so tov. And you go and you read Revelation. Do you know what God's goal in Revelation is? Is to get creation back to tov. To bring it back the way it's supposed to be. So one can come to creation, look at creation, look at nature, and one can see God or not see God. That's the Holy Spirit at work, bringing the eyes of faith, right? And if we look at creation with the eyes of faith, if we see the fingerprints of God, we see it as inspiring. And it ties to His Son who came and made a sacrifice that's life-giving. We as believers should thank God for the beauty of life in nature. And we should thank God in our hearts for the relationship that comes to us through Jesus Christ. So this week, watch nature. What amazes you in nature? Is it the sun coming up in the morning or the blast of color at night? Is it a solar eclipse where you got to wear funky glasses to stare at it? Is it the oceans filled with all those beautiful fish? Is it a star-filled night where you're laying on your back on a mountain and there's so many stars it's so lit up in the sky you can barely fall asleep? Is it the quiet rustling of a breeze in the leaves and the branches of a tree overhead? Is it a massive forest? Is it the power of a hurricane crashing into the coast of Texas? We need to take time to appreciate the creativity, the beauty, the complexity and the goodness, the tov of God's design, and consider how God has designed us to live our lives in a faithful, God-honoring way. In His holy and precious name, amen.